Welcome to the Discernment Drop. We are here to really analyze and dissect the foundational ideas that shape our culture. And we do that no matter how sensitive or, controversial the resulting analysis might be. Today, we're wading into a truly difficult topic, but one that is just everywhere: the concept of self-esteem.
And this one requires some real intellectual rigor, because we're not just talking about psychological methods here.
No, not at all.
We are examining a very high-level theological and, I'd say, philosophical critique, one that challenges the very moral foundation of modern education, of modern parenting.
So we have to approach this analytically.
Exactly. We have to understand that we're synthesizing a very controversial but also a very highly structured argument.
Absolutely. And our mission, as always, is just to understand the source material as thoroughly as we can and then convey its argument impartially to you. The primary source we're scrutinizing today is a comprehensive theological analysis. It's called Excerpts from Self-Esteem, The Devil's Education of Beasts. And it was written by Pastor John L. Widdifield for Remnant Church and Online Ministries.
And our goal is to give you the shortcut to really understanding the depth of this particular critique.
Right. And the core thesis is, well, it's designed to be provocative. It's meant to shock the listener out of a certain complacency.
It's very provocative. Pastor John L. Widdifield, and we'll be referring to him as Pastor John from here on out.
Okay.
He makes this really stunning claim that the self-esteem movement isn't just some benign, failed social experiment.
No.
He calls it the devil's education.
Yeah.
And he argues that it is deliberately designed to turn a generation, quite literally, into beasts.
And that language right there, it just immediately elevates the conversation. We're past standard educational theory now.
Oh, completely.
We're into something with spiritual and profound societal stakes.
Yes.
Pastor John frames this as a massive strategic shift in how, destructive forces operate in the world. He argues that the first strategy, the direct one, was trying to prevent parents from raising children in the image of God.
Right. A direct confrontation. But he says that proved insufficient. It couldn't completely halt moral formation, so the strategy had to pivot.
And the pivot was, in his view, incredibly cunning because it co-opted the very institutions that were designed for formation.
Schools, the parenting culture.
Exactly. So instead of preventing formation, the new strategy was to convince the entire system to raise children not in the image of God, but in the image of self.
And that contrast, the image bearer versus the self-image, that's really the theological engine that drives this entire critique.
So what we're really dealing with is a replacement strategy. The form of, say, discipleship remains, but the object of worship, the thing you're aspiring to, changes completely.
It changes from an objective, divine standard to the subjective internal self. Precisely. If you can make the self the center of the universe, you don't actually need to destroy the concept of training or formation. You just redefine the goal.
And the goal becomes self-affirmation.
Instead of self-mastery, yes.
So let's unpack this replacement theology. Pastor John actually calls it the gospel of self-esteem.
Which implies it has the structure and authority of a faith.
Yes, exactly. A faith, but one that is dedicated entirely to the self. And he claims this one single concept has systematically just decimated an entire constellation of traditional difficult virtues.
The list he provides is so critical here because it really identifies what was, for centuries, the traditional work of Christian discipleship and even classical moral philosophy.
These were all ideas focused on what you might call spiritual friction.
Spiritual friction, I like that. And the common thread in all of them is self-mastery.
Right.
So Pastor John argues that self-esteem replaced self-control, self-denial, self-sacrifice, self-examination, self-awareness, the concept of dying to self, and discipling yourself before God. Look at that list of 7 discarded concepts. Every single one of them involves a strenuous act of the will.
It's about restraint.
Restraint against your natural impulse, humility before some objective standard, and often some level of pain or discomfort.
It's that moment where an individual has to say, my immediate desire is wrong, or at least it must wait.
Yes, that's the friction you were talking about. And Pastor John's core analysis, the thing this all builds on, is that self-esteem is the one virtue that by its very definition requires no virtue at all.
That's a huge statement. We have to unpack that.
Yeah.
How, in this view, does virtue inherently involve struggle? And how does self-esteem get to just bypass that whole requirement?
Okay, so the distinction is in the direction of the correction.
The direction.
Yeah, so classical and theological virtue is what you call teleological. It aims toward an objective external good. That could be God, truth, justice, whatever it is.
Something outside of you.
Exactly. And to achieve that external good, the internal self must be disciplined. It has to be transformed. So virtue is the process of correcting the internal self to meet that external standard.
And so struggle is just baked into the process.
It's unavoidable because the natural, or what he'd call the fallen self, resists being changed.
Okay, so that's virtue. Then what about self-esteem?
Well, self-esteem, as its critique here, argues the complete opposite. It argues the self is already sufficient, or whole, maybe even perfect. It just needs validation, not transformation.
So if the self is the standard,
Then any pain, any discomfort, it must be caused by the external world failing to recognize the self's inherent perfection.
I see. So there's no need for struggle or self-denial. The only action required is for the outside world to affirm you.
Yes, you just need affirmation.
So the argument is that self-esteem is this kind of theological vacuum, a concept that demands nothing but celebrating whatever state you're currently in. And he says this led to catastrophic results. Let's get into the mechanism of that switch. How did we move from, what was the historical consensus on raising kids to this modern educational doctrine?
Pastor John claims that really, across time and across virtually all successful civilizations, there was this one consensus.
Which was?
That children were born with powerful and often, destructive impulses.
Yeah.
And the entire point of education, of parenting, was to train the child to master those impulses.
That mastery was seen as the prerequisite for being a mature adult, a citizen.
It was about installing self-government, internal self-government.
And Pastor John identifies this really critical semantic pivot, a change in language where the modern system redefined the whole process.
Yes, this is key. Instead of calling this essential training mastery or discipleship,
I started calling it suppression.
and that word choice is, in his view, fatal to the traditional process. Well, think about it. If I suppress something, the implication is that I'm damaging myself. I'm forcing down a natural, healthy impulse. But if I master something, I am governing an unruly part of myself for a higher objective good.
So by framing discipline as suppression,
The modern educational system effectively outlawed the very tools required to build what he would call true character.
and this shift has these immediate consequences, both in the home and in the classroom. It creates what you called earlier emotional heliocentrism.
Exactly. If mastery is bad, if it's suppression, then the goal of parenting and teaching shifts completely. It's no longer about restraining the child's emotions. It's about protecting them.
The child's feelings, their anxiety, their instant desires, they become the central, untouchable authority.
Untouchable is the right word. Pastor John argues the child is fundamentally repositioned as the sun, and the parents, the teachers, even objective reality itself, they all become these orbiting planets.
And their only purpose is to maintain the stability and comfort of the child's emotional ecosystem. But the moment reality is forced to revolve around a child's emotions, instead of the child learning to navigate reality,
Growth stops.
it has to.
It cannot proceed because maturity requires you to acknowledge that the universe is, frankly, indifferent to your immediate feelings.
Right.
If you teach a child that reality has to yield to their anxiety or their appetite, you prevent the necessary friction that forges resilience. And the result is the creature Pastor John calls the beast.
That's such a powerful, even shocking term. We need to be really meticulous here in analyzing what he means by beast. It's not just a label for a rebellious kid.
No, he's very specific. A beast is defined not by its fangs, not by some inherent malicious evil,
Okay.
but by its lack of brakes.
A lack of brakes.
It's a creature ruled entirely by three forces: appetite, anxiety, and the need for affirmation. It is incapable of self-governance because its life is directed by impulse and neuroses rather than by virtues like truth, wisdom, and restraint.
So the beast is defined by unconstrained movement. Appetite drives it to consume. Anxiety drives it to avoid things. And affirmation drives it to seek validation from others.
It's a completely reactive existence, yes.
And think about the societal implications of that.
Go on.
A child who is taught that his feelings are sacred becomes an adult who is incapable of sacrificing their immediate comfort for some long-term responsibility.
Pastor John argues that kind of individual just can't participate in a moral, civil society. A society that requires you to suspend your self-interest for the common good, or to adhere to an objective, transcendent truth.
If you have no internal brake pedal, you're inherently dangerous, even if you aren't actively malicious.
You're simply unconstrained.
This is a really strong philosophical claim. He's suggesting that the self-esteem movement created a whole new anthropological state, the beast. That is just the logical, inevitable result of letting impulse be your highest moral authority.
And this unconstrained state is precisely what makes the individual so vulnerable to external manipulation, which is a point we will definitely return to.
Because if your internal state is dictated by anxiety and this constant search for affirmation,
You are perpetually dependent on systems and people that promise to meet those needs for you. And that dependency, according to Pastor John, is the key outcome of this whole theological replacement. So Pastor John asserts that this philosophical shift, it didn't just happen in the ether. It was formalized institutionally during the 1980s and 90s.
right, the height of the self-esteem revolution in American public schools.
And he frames this period not as some kind of progressive accident, but as an explicit, formalized pact.
The pact, as we heard, was based on what seems like a totally innocuous premise. If we can make kids feel good about themselves, they'll do better.
It sounds like enlightened compassion. It's very appealing.
It is. So why does Pastor John consider that specific premise to be the foundational lie?
Because in his theological framework, he completely inverts the necessary relationship between action and emotion.
It gets it backwards.
Totally backwards. The premise assumes emotion is the necessary precursor to moral action. The lie is that emotional comfort is what drives performance and virtue.
And the theological counterargument is?
Absolute. You don't feel good and then do good. You do good and then you feel good.
That's the cornerstone of the whole critique.
It is. Positive emotion, from a theological perspective, should be the reward. It should be the consequence of aligning your actions with objective truth, with responsibility, with moral effort.
So if you invert that, you've trained a generation to prioritize feeling good before they put in the effort or take responsibility.
Which paralyzes them.
How so?
It paralyzes them when the right thing to do is hard and unpleasant or just doesn't feel right. They end up waiting for the feeling, which may never come, or they just avoid the difficult action altogether.
So this inversion is devastating because it teaches you to use your emotions as a kind of moral screening device.
That's a great way to put it.
If an action makes me feel uncomfortable, then the action must be wrong. If an idea challenges my current self-image, the idea must be oppressive.
Which fundamentally prevents the kind of growth required for moral maturity.
And this inversion then birthed the 4 critical pairs of theological replacements that Pastor John identifies.
And these aren't subtle changes. He presents them as a total overhaul of the spiritual infrastructure of a growing mind.
Okay, let's break these pairs down in detail. The first replacement is foundational. Self-esteem replaced responsibility. How does prioritizing self-worth actively push responsibility out of the picture?
Well, responsibility requires accountability.
Right.
And accountability means you have to admit failure or wrongdoing, which is inherently painful. It threatens the fragile self-image of a child who's been raised on affirmation.
So if a child fails a test or, makes a moral mistake,
The self-esteem model requires you to mitigate the emotional damage first. And that mitigation often involves excusing the failure or blaming external factors or just lowering the standard.
whereas responsibility demands the opposite.
It demands ownership, maybe repentance, and real effort to change the self. You cannot simultaneously affirm a child's inherent perfection and demand strenuous accountability. The two goals are just. They're mutually exclusive.
So failure becomes a psychological threat to be shielded from rather than a call to action.
It's emotional triage, not character formation.
Yes. Okay, the second replacement follows logically from that. Feelings replaced facts.
We talked about how the child becomes the son. When feelings replace facts, the ultimate arbiter of truth shifts from objective external reality to subjective internal experience.
This sounds directly related to the contemporary debates about my truth versus the truth.
It is. Pastor John's critique really anticipated this. Facts are rigid. They demand that you submit to an outside world that doesn't care about your feelings.
For example,
If you accept the fact that the speed limit is 70, you have to submit your driving behavior to that truth, regardless of how fast you feel like going. When feelings replace facts, the individual is basically licensed to dismiss any objective reality that causes them distress or challenges their subjective emotional state. And that, right there, is the cornerstone of unteachability.
which brings us to the third pair. Therapy replaced discipleship. These are two massive concepts that, in Pastor John's view, are Well, they're diametrically opposed in their purpose.
Discipleship in the source's context is this rigorous, often painful process of subjecting the self to an external divine standard, that whole dying to self idea.
It requires you to acknowledge that the self is broken and needs transformation.
Exactly. The focus is external and demanding. Therapy, on the other hand, as Pastor John frames it here, is presented as the process of accommodating reality to the self's emotional comfort.
Primarily through validation and affirmation.
The focus is internal and cushioning.
So the goal of discipleship is transformation, which implies pain is part of the process.
And the goal of this specific definition of therapy is emotional equilibrium, which implies that pain should be minimized at all costs.
They're two separate faiths, really.
They are. One says you must change to fit the truth. The other says we will affirm your inner truth and we will challenge the external pressures. Pastor John sees this as a fundamental shift away from spiritual confrontation and towards just emotional maintenance.
And finally, the fourth pair, identity replaced character. If character is forged through action and struggle and objective morality, what is this new replacement concept of identity?
Well, character, for Pastor John, is built through that hard work we listed earlier: self-control, sacrifice. It's demonstrated performance. It's about adherence to virtue.
In identity.
Identity, in the specific modern sense he's critiquing, is often presented as this fixed internal emotional or psychological state that's already fully formed. It just requires recognition from the outside world.
So it's a status that exists independent of any disciplined action or moral framework.
Exactly. You are asked to validate who the person feels they are, rather than asking what the person has done or what moral code they follow. The emphasis shifts entirely from the moral resume to the emotional declaration.
And the cumulative result of these four replacements, according to the source, is just devastating.
He says it created a generation that is softer, sadder, angrier, weaker, more confused, and more dependent. This is the logical end product of that self-esteem curriculum.
This softening and confusion, it leads us directly to his synthesis of the beast-minded worldview.
Yes, this is the philosophical belief system that's the direct application of those four replacements. It's the new curriculum that's taught when traditional virtue is removed.
And this worldview is critical because it represents, in his view, the explicit inversion of theological truth, mirroring the original temptation in Eden.
Yes, he identifies 7 specific articles of faith for this self-as-God movement. We should probably list them out and look at them carefully.
Let's do it.
Okay, the first claim is that restraint is oppression. If the self is inherently perfect and sacred, then any external limit, from parents, God, society, it's not perceived as guidance.
It's perceived as an attack.
As a deliberate act inhibiting your natural, healthy expression. Yes.
This completely redefines the concept of rules. The second article is that rules are violence.
Just the existence of a boundary, even a necessary safety boundary, is interpreted as an aggressive act against the sovereignty of the individual self.
And that leads to the third idea, which is maybe the most damaging for any kind of spiritual formation. Correction is trauma.
This is the ultimate defensive measure. It's built right into the self-esteem framework. If you're held accountable, you might fail. If you fail, your self-esteem is threatened.
So accountability itself has to be redefined as a form of psychological harm.
Which prevents the essential process of critique and repentance and growth. You can't learn if you can't be corrected.
And if correction is trauma, then it follows that authority is abuse.
Exactly. Any person or institution trying to enforce an external standard, a parent, a church, a government, they're all inherently suspect. They must be acting out of a desire to dominate you, not to guide you.
So submission to any higher order is just rejected out of hand.
It is. And the epistemological shift follows right after that with the claim that truth is subjective. Since feelings replaced facts, the individual is taught that objective reality is either inaccessible or just irrelevant compared to my lived experience.
Or my truth.
Or my truth. This destroys any common ground for civic or spiritual discourse.
And then we get to the most dangerous article of faith, the one that establishes the new idol. Feelings are sacred.
They become the ultimate, unassailable moral standard. They can't be questioned, they can't be judged, they can't be disciplined, they can only be validated.
So if a feeling exists, it carries moral weight simply because it is felt.
And finally, connecting all of this directly back to Eden, the pervasive, implicit message underlying all 7 of these claims is that serpent's whisper.
You don't need God. You can be your own God.
The self-esteem curriculum, in Pastor John's analysis, is simply the practical implementation of that ancient lie. But it's passed down by adults who were convinced they were acting with compassion.
It is a sobering thought. That the very adults entrusted with forming character were instead installing a philosophical framework that pretty much guarantees dependence and emotional fragility.
All under the banner of psychological health.
Exactly. And this transition brings us to what Pastor John identifies as the great irony of the self-esteem revolution.
Mhm.
After 4 decades of rigorous, mandated affirmation, you're special, you're perfect, you're valid, the promised outcome of resilient, confident, high-functioning individuals, it just never materialized.
Not at all. If the metric for success was, better kids who do better, then the empirical evidence, according to this critique, shows a catastrophic failure.
The source provides a really comprehensive and, frankly, disturbing litany of misery. It catalogs all the negative societal outcomes that Pastor John links directly back to this curriculum.
We should probably review that catalog, because the cumulative weight of this evidence is the critical pivot point in his argument. It moves from philosophy to real-world consequences.
Okay, so 40 years later, Pastor John claims we have created the loneliest generation in history.
Which is fascinating, isn't it? Because self-esteem was supposed to foster social confidence.
Right. It seems like a paradox.
The critique implies that if you build your worth on the affirmation of others, you become desperately reliant on that external validation, which is fleeting, it's unstable, and so it leads, paradoxically, to isolation and loneliness.
You're always chasing it.
Always.
Okay.
Furthermore, the source claims we've created the most medicated, the most anxious, and the most depressed generation.
And the logic there is.
If emotional pain is defined as a threat that you have to mitigate, rather than a signal for necessary change or effort, then the individual has to turn to something, external medication, therapy, to stabilize the internal system that reality keeps shaking up.
It results in mass anxiety because you're never equipped to actually handle a confrontation with reality.
You're not. And crucially, the source adds, the most identity confused. If character is abandoned for identity and truth is subjective, the individual has no external anchor to define who they are.
Which leads to this deep systemic confusion about purpose and selfhood.
The list just keeps going. He says it's the most fragile and easily manipulated generation, the least resilient, the least spiritually grounded, and ultimately the least prepared for adulthood.
So the cumulative effect, in his view, is that the self-esteem movement failed completely, even on its own stated terms.
It produced the absolute inverse of its goal.
And this is where the critique takes a very sharp turn. It moves from blaming mere incompetence to suggesting an intentional strategy.
Yes, the conclusion Pastor John draws is that self-esteem did not build confidence, it built dependence.
And then he adds that chilling qualifier.
And that was the plan all along.
This is the critical moment. This is where the critique shifts into what you might call a theological conspiracy theory.
It does. Because if the goal was actually to create dependent, fragile, and unresilient individuals, then the curriculum was a massive success.
Because individuals who are ruled by anxiety and appetite and this desperate need for affirmation.
They are fundamentally unable to self-govern. They become dependent on systems, therapeutic, governmental, educational, to provide the emotional and material stability they were never taught how to build internally.
The moment you build dependence, you enable external control. And this is what Pastor John identifies as the devil's endgame, making the nation unteachable.
He clarifies that the ultimate goal is not necessarily worship, but unteachability.
And why is that a more effective tool for control?
Because the unteachable mind is resistant to the very things necessary for liberation: objective truth, spiritual discipline, moral correction. If you cannot be taught, you cannot recognize a higher moral authority, and you cannot organize any kind of resistance.
Pastor John then traces this progression, showing how that individual fragility scales up into a kind of societal paralysis.
It starts with the unteachable child, which leads to the unteachable teen, and then the unteachable adult.
But the real danger is when they take on their public roles.
Yes, the unteachable adult becomes the unteachable voter. And this is an individual who cannot submit their subjective feelings to an objective analysis of policy. They can't tolerate factual evidence that contradicts their emotional comfort.
They're seeking political validation of their identity, not governance based on truth.
Which makes them easily swayed by any platform that just promises to protect them from uncomfortable reality.
And this extends into the spiritual realm, too. The unteachable church member.
Right. This is the individual who can't submit to traditional spiritual correction or doctrine or the authority of Scripture because their sacred feelings conflict with the external demands of faith.
Discipleship is impossible if correction is defined as trauma.
It can't happen. And the culmination of all this mass dependence and refusal to be taught is an unteachable nation.
The implication from Pastor John is clear. A nation where the majority of the population is fragile, driven by anxiety, demanding affirmation, and incapable of self-mastery.
Is a nation that requires perpetual external control just to maintain stability. The self-esteem movement, therefore, becomes a political tool, leveraging emotional fragility for spiritual and political subservience.
So the critique frames self-esteem not as some misguided psychological fad, but as a deliberate mechanism for mass manipulation and control.
Creating a population that is perpetually looking outside of themselves for the validation and stability they were taught they couldn't generate internally.
It's a paradox.
The self-as-God movement paradoxically creates maximum psychological fragility, which then mandates maximum institutional dependence. The beast-minded generation, ruled by impulse and anxiety, demands a master.
Okay, so having laid out such a comprehensive and frankly stark critique of the modern paradigm, Pastor John then shifts. He moves to the counter-framework, the ancient solution.
Which he says is surprisingly uncomplicated. It just requires a return to reality and objective truth.
The source material is adamant about what children do not need. They don't need self-esteem.
No. Their fundamental need, he says, is rooted entirely in external reality and inner formation. Pastor John lists the true necessities. Children need truth, discipline, purpose, courage, limits, roots, and righteousness.
And these are all the building blocks of character. They thrive on friction and restraint.
The very things the self-esteem philosophy seeks to eliminate.
And this requires a complete reorientation of the parental mandate, moving away from that emotional triage and back toward moral instruction.
Yes, and he outlines this specific language of accountability that parents have to internalize and use to actively counter the beast mentality that's being created by the wider culture.
This language is defined by the refusal to co-sign a subjective emotional reality when it conflicts with objective moral or physical truth.
It requires parents to establish a clear, non-negotiable external moral boundary by simply saying, no, that's wrong.
And that simple statement immediately removes the child's feeling from the throne.
And places an objective standard in its place.
The second phrase he mentions conveys expectation and potential. It rejects the idea that the child's current state is acceptable if it falls short of their capabilities. That phrase is, you will do better.
That's such a powerful corrective. It combines accountability with hope. It denies the child the refuge of learned helplessness, but it simultaneously affirms the parent's belief in the child's potential for self-mastery, for transformation.
It mandates growth.
It does.
Then there is the direct counter to that replacement of responsibility we talked about, the phrase, you are accountable.
This forces the child to own their actions and their consequences. It breaks that cycle of excuse-making and external blame.
There's no negotiation. The self has to submit to the consequences of its own choices.
And then there's the theological anchor for the entire argument. You belong to God, not your emotions.
That is maybe the most profound theological counterstatement in the whole piece.
I think so. It directly rejects the sacredness of feelings and places the child's entire being under divine authority that demands self-control and restraint. It shifts the primary identity from internal emotion to external covenant.
And finally, the necessary corrective for that emotional heliocentrism. You are loved, but you are not the center of the universe.
Which affirms the child's inherent value, while at the same time instilling the necessary humility that prevents the beast mindset from growing.
The child has to understand that they are cherished, but their value doesn't mandate the subservience of everyone or everything else.
And this leads to the final necessary dichotomy that Pastor John establishes.
Which is?
The way to raise beasts is to tell them they are perfect in their current state. You validate every impulse and you discourage all effort towards transformation.
And the way to raise disciples is to tell them the truth.
Even when the truth is uncomfortable or demanding or requires painful effort.
And of course, the requirement of modeling is paramount here.
Oh, absolutely. The language of accountability is useless if the parents themselves are exhibiting that beast mindset, if they're ruled by appetite and anxiety and their own need for affirmation.
Parents have to model the kind of life that proves that God or objective truth is demonstrably more trustworthy and more stabilizing than their own shifting feelings.
And so his ultimate conclusion circles right back to the core spiritual needs. Children do not need affirmation of their emotional status. They need the fear of the Lord,
which he defines as a respectful, awe-filled acknowledgement of a higher authority.
The beginning of wisdom. They need the truth, which anchors them firmly in objective reality. And they need the Word of God, which provides the external, unchanging standard for character, correction, and instruction.
This has been a really rigorous and detailed breakdown of Pastor John L. Widdifield's critical analysis of self-esteem.
Mm-hmm.
What emerges is this detailed theological battle plan. It frames the core conflict of modern formation as a choice between prioritizing the image of God, which demands transformation and self-mastery.
And prioritizing the image of self, which promises affirmation but, he argues, guarantees dependence.
The compelling nature of this critique, I think, lies in its sophisticated mechanism, how it links what seems like simple, compassionate teaching
Directly to these grand theological and political consequences. The journey from emotional fragility to personal dependence, and then to the ultimate societal outcome of an unteachable, easily manipulated population. It presents a very disturbing feedback loop.
The argument suggests that by creating individuals who are perpetually soft, anxious, and dependent on validation, that very fragility becomes a powerful resource for external forces.
Whether they are political, commercial, or spiritual forces seeking manipulation.
Validation becomes the currency of control.
And that focus on the unteachable voter and the easily manipulated adult, that provides the real-world application of this theory. It posits that if you cannot stand on the bedrock of objective truth and self-mastery, you are forced to seek external masters who promise to protect your sacred feelings.
So, as we conclude this discernment drop, let's leave you with a provocative thought that is built directly on Pastor John's final plea regarding dependence and control.
Okay.
If the self-esteem movement really does result in generations characterized by anxiety, dependence, and unteachability, what specific political, commercial, or spiritual platforms in contemporary society are currently structured to actively leverage that cultivated fragility for mass manipulation?
Look for the systems that reward the expression of anxiety and then immediately provide affirmation as a substitute for action or correction.
Because that, according to this analysis,
Is where the fruit of the devil's education is being harvested.
Thank you for joining us on this rigorous discernment drop. We hope this analysis gives you the framework necessary to critically examine the assumptions that underlie so many modern emotional and educational philosophies.